There are many definitions of sustainability. Here at Sembcorp, sustainability is safeguarding the future. To us, that future is bright. We harness the power of the sun and wind, design low-carbon sustainable solutions for green urban cities, and lay the foundation for generations to come. Sustainability is innovation, challenging the norms and leading disruption. We innovate to solve complex global problems. We use our experiences to create opportunities from challenges. Sustainability is about the communities. We care for the communities and aim to improve their quality of life. We forge strong partnerships and leverage our platforms in the region to deliver sustainable solutions. Our success is founded upon the trust from the communities we serve. Sustainability is about our people. Our success is bolstered by the strength and energy of one Sembcorp team, a team that can thrive in the current and future world. Sustainability is not just a catchphrase. To us, sustainability is our business.
Hello, everyone, and thank you all for joining us today. My name is Randy Bell, and I am the Director of the Global Energy Center at the Atlantic Council. It is a pleasure to welcome you to this session at Singapore International Energy Week, and I want to thank the organizers for inviting the Atlantic Council and me to participate again this year, hoping to get back to Singapore as soon as possible. Today's discussion will focus on the Biden administration's energy policy and its implications for Asia's energy transition. We will discuss the United States clean energy deployment priorities and their impact on development and climate goals of major partners and allies in the Indo-Pacific. Asia will account for a significant share of global energy growth out to 2050, and countries across the region are rapidly becoming among the most important energy markets in the world, as well as key technological players and producers in the technologies of the future energy system. With worsening climate impacts and ahead of the critical COP26 summit next week, the urgent need to reduce emissions quickly is abundantly clear. Asia will be critical to the Biden administration's ability to achieve its climate goals and to reestablish the United States as a global clean energy and climate leader. To that end, we will be hearing presentations from a distinguished set of experts today on both U.S. energy policy priorities and the geopolitics and economics of energy development in the Indo-Pacific region. I would first like to introduce and turn it over to our keynote speaker for today's session, who will help frame today's discussion on the administration's energy priorities in the Asia-Pacific. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome Harry Kamian, the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary and Acting Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Energy Resources at the U.S. Department of State. Harry, over to you for your opening remarks.
Randy, thank you very much for the kind introduction. The State Department has a long history of participating in Atlantic Council events, and I appreciate the opportunity to be with you today. I also, like you, wish that I'd had the opportunity to be in Singapore and present, and looking forward to having the opportunity to be there on the ground in future years. I also want to tell you that I appreciate the opportunity to be on the panel with David. I had the opportunity to support David many years ago when he came out to Vietnam during one of his trips in his previous capacity, and I'm looking forward to working with David and other members of the council going forward. I finally thank you everyone who's joined from around the globe, in particular our colleagues across the Indo-Pacific. We realize it's pretty late there, and so appreciate you very much. As Randy noted, G20 leaders are poised to meet in Rome, and COP is just a few days away. The Biden administration is committed to pursuing ambitious and aggressive action to meet this pivotal moment when it comes to the climate crisis, and supporting a sustained and swift economic recovery that delivers security and opportunity for the American people, as well as for the peoples of the Indo-Pacific region. During his first week in office, President Biden outlined his vision for addressing the climate crisis at home and abroad, establishing as a key domestic and foreign policy priority. President Biden has committed the U.S. to decisive action this decade, a 50 to 52% reduction in carbon emissions by 2030, and a doubling of our international financial commitment consistent with the 100 billion Paris goal. At home, we are taking significant steps to ensure the United States is on the path to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. The administration is advancing the most ambitious climate legislation ever attempted in this country. We are aiming to have half of all new cars on the road electric powered by 2030 and to have a net zero power sector by 2035. The administration has opened up coastal areas to wind power development and is targeting enormous increases in solar power. We are funding research into new fuels, such as hydrogen, and advancing technologies such as carbon capture and storage. So what are the implications of our new energy policy for Asia's energy transition? As Randy noted, the Indo-Pacific region is projected to be the epicenter of global energy demand growth through 2040. We are engaging in intensive discussions and debates about the cost of the energy transition with partners, allies, and others in the region, as well as the investments we collectively must make to address the urgency of the climate crisis. We are encouraging countries to increase their climate ambitions and their nationally determined contributions. And many have demonstrated already a very strong commitment to the fight against climate change. They are reducing their dependence on fossil fuels and planning to install enough renewable energy infrastructure to power millions of homes. They're committing to developing renewable energy industries that will create thousands of new jobs. And the Biden administration is committed to supporting these efforts to create reliable and secure energy on the one hand and address decarbonization on the other. So how are we doing that? We are providing technological, financial, and regulatory assistance to overcome challenges and speed up the energy transition. We realize that making the switch to clean energy is complicated. It involves new technologies and new ways of doing businesses. And we are sharing our experiences and integrating these new technologies with others in the region. We are supporting partners' efforts to introduce variable renewable electricity into their power grids. We are assisting others with the introduction of innovative technologies such as battery energy storage systems. We are providing regulatory guidance because even the best technology won't be rolled out if the regulatory regimes don't make it profitable for investors. And we're cooperating on financing, working together with the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank to provide loans at competitive rates for clean energy investment. We understand very well that sufficient financing mechanisms are critical. Based on our discussions with others in the region, we understand it's especially true for governments with the political will to undertake ambitious investments, but those governments may not have sufficient funds to do so. And as many of you on this call know, representing the private sector, mobilizing private investment must be a key part of the solution. To this end, the United States is introducing programs in the region to give the business community the confidence they need to make the major investments necessary to deploy clean energy and reach climate targets. We are also initiating programs to improve the resiliency of supply chains needed for energy transition. These efforts will ensure the critical minerals needed for clean energy technologies will be mined sustainably, protecting the supply chain despite the ever-increasing demand. We are learning from our partners in the region what challenges they face in their energy transitions, and together we're working towards solutions. A few examples to illustrate this point. In Vietnam, the Department of State is supporting the integration of more than 16 gigawatts of new solar generation. In Thailand, we are backing a new energy forecasting center to help the electric utility prepare more variable renewable energy. In South Asia, we collaborate with government efforts in Bangladesh, Nepal, and Sri Lanka to scale up renewable energy generation through financial and technical assistance. And we're bringing the private sector and government together to tackle the climate crisis hand in hand. For example, across the region, we have invited countries to join the Clean Energy Demand Initiative. This program builds on commitments that over 325 corporations, including Walmart, Apple, Nike, and Google have made to go 100% renewable by 2050. The companies make a non-binding pledge to invest in renewable energy in countries which have signed on to the program. In return, the countries agree to a voluntary set of principles to encourage clean energy investment and decarbonization. The result, added confidence by governments around the world that corporations will invest in power capacity to complement broader cross-sectoral investment. All of this work, our diplomatic engagement, technical assistance, and the private sector advocacy supports the broad goal of increasing access to affordable, reliable, clean energy in the region. The Biden administration understands that the road ahead is long. It's not going to be easy, and there no doubt will be challenging times ahead. But we're committed to working with our Indo-Pacific allies, partners, and others in the region in the decades to come to achieve our climate ambitions and to leave a safer, more prosperous world for our children. Randy, thank you very much for the opportunity to engage in this discussion.
Thanks so much. Really ambitious agenda. I'd love to ask just a couple of questions. First, what next week is COP26. Hugely important. I know there's just a lot riding on this meeting. What outcomes are you hoping for from the COP, and how important is the summit for shaping the United States' climate engagement in the Asia Pacific?
It's important. Our goals are ambitious, and as you noted, the region is incredibly important in terms of achieving those goals. I think I might boil it down to three. One, we're looking to come out of Glasgow significantly more on track to keeping 1.5 degrees Celsius limit on warming within reach. Two, we'd like to emerge with a collective commitment to continue strengthening climate ambition during this decisive decade. Really, the run up to 2030 is key. And then finally, we hope to come out of Glasgow with an agreement on a set of rules that ensures all parties to the agreement execute it transparently and with environmental integrity. Two key elements which we think are pretty important to the agreement. COP's important to all of us. It's a global commitment. I think it's particularly important to the Indo-Pacific, and we hope to see our partners and our allies and others in the region commit to more ambitious climate goals.
Got it. Thank you. Well, one more question. I know you have a very busy day in advance of the COP, but just one more question. So we are right now in the midst of a global energy crisis, shortages of natural gas and coal driving price spikes. They're threatening to have critical shortfalls in the coming winter. We've seen countries in Asia rush to produce more coal to combat this energy crisis. As we look ahead, what are the implications of the crisis for the Biden administration's clean energy and climate priorities in the region?
Randy, I think you said it really well, that the current global energy crisis is indeed imposing substantial hardships on people and industries around the world. In our discussions with allies and partners, we're very acutely aware of that. In our estimate, our partners in the region will adapt by using the least expensive energy options available to them in the near term. It makes common sense. But when the energy crisis ends, when the short-term imbalance between supply and demand ends, in our assessment, the region and the world will face the same threat of climate change. It's not going away. Indo-Pacific governments, in our view, know that this climate change is an urgent problem and one that requires long-term solutions. In our estimate, the more countries can generate power from renewable sources, the less they will depend on fossil fuel energy markets with their periodic volatility. We stand ready to support our partners to meet these commitments. We know it's going to be a challenging time ahead, but in our view, if we work together and look out for each other, I think we can address this short-term imbalance.
Got it. Thank you. Well, I know you have to run, so thank you so much, Assistant Secretary Kamian, for your remarks and for being here with us today. Best of luck going into Glasgow. I know that the work is very intense in these coming days. We would now like to dive into our presentations for the rest of the session. We'll be hearing remarks from 3 experts, after which we'll jump into a panel discussion. As a reminder, before we get started, after our speakers' remarks, you can submit questions through the Q&A function on the Singapore International Energy Week portal. So they will come to me through the app. I will try to get to as many questions as I can during our discussion. So please feel free to use that opportunity to ask questions. Our presenters today will be David Goldwyn, who is the chairman of the Energy Advisory Group at the Atlantic Council and a senior fellow with us, and also the principal of Goldwyn Global Strategies. Rich Powell, who is the executive director of ClearPath, and Ashley Johnson, the director for Energy and Environmental Affairs at the National Bureau of Asian Research. So a really great group of experts. Let's first hand it over to David for your remarks.
Great. Thanks so much, Randy, and greetings to everyone at Singapore International Energy Week. It's great to be back and terrific to be on a panel with Ashley and Rich, and haven't seen Harry Kamian in probably a decade since we were both in Vietnam. So really, really terrific. Randy, let me talk a little bit about how the energy transition is happening in the United States, because I think it's important to understand that it's moving forward here for a variety of reasons. And the federal government policy, what happens in Congress, is really one small portion of that. Really, market forces more than anything else are what's driving the energy transition forward here in the US. Institutional investors and insurers are recalculating risk and are making demands on companies to adjust those risks and explain how their businesses are going to survive in the next 10 and 20 years. So you've seen major US and international companies, as Harry referred to, adopting net zero targets by 2050 and plans to make significant progress by 2030. And they're doing that in response to institutional investors, to their own employees, and to their consumers and customers as well. US states have long had their own policies. Regional greenhouse gas initiative in the Northeast is one. 28 states have clean energy standards or clean energy targets of their own. So it's really moving forward. And federal government policy, federal regulatory policy is going to have a significant impact on the speed at which this transition takes place. And that's really what this is about. So over the long run, the kinds of rules that we're going to see, which are on regulating methane emissions, other pollutants, more disclosure of direct, indirect, and cumulative impacts of infrastructure projects, and also environmental justice considerations and permitting. All that's going to be taking place, in coming weeks. The way we regulate automotive emissions is going to change, both incentives for electric vehicles and also support for charging stations. So all of this is about accelerating the energy transition. Legislation absolutely helps, and it would have been nice to have a clean energy performance program, our own version of a clean energy standard, which looks like it's not going to happen. But it's, that and other things are accelerating faster transmission, faster deployment for trends that are happening. So those that worry about the ping pong effect, whether the US is still going to be there if we have a change in government, I think these trends are really irreversible. But time is of the essence, and major companies are going to be demanding help on a framework which incentivizes carbon capture, which accelerates deployment, which means that Republicans are going to start having a climate policy starting in 2022, because the companies that are strong supporters of the Republican Party are going to insist on it. There's no question the timing of our political wrangling in the run-up to Glasgow is not helpful. And this morning, the president is headed to Capitol Hill to try and push for, finalizing that, at least a framework agreement before he heads to Glasgow and the G20 meeting. This global energy crisis, has pointed out some realities that are tough for the administration and others to accept. It's an energy transition, not an energy revolution. You've got to manage the cost. You got to manage the ability to make that transition. And I think the real uncomfortable truth for the administration is that natural gas is going to be an important part of this energy transition. And it's going to be key, in the next few years to make hydrocarbons affordable so that we don't have the kind of price spikes that scares people off of renewables, while accelerating deployment investment in renewables because they're not subject to commodity fluctuations in the first place. So gas is really the big elephant in the room. And I think, what we have to appreciate, and what the countries in Asia appreciate, is that every region is different. In some places, gas is a substitute for coal. In others, it's a backup for renewables. In others, it's a provider of heat. But it needs to be affordable, available, and politically acceptable in order to prevent the resurgence of coal. And as we're seeing in Asia today, and even in the United States, coal is on the rise. Coal is up 23% in the United States. The EIA projects that in non-OECD Asia, coal-fired generation, is going to grow, almost as fast as renewable energy. And 75% of the world's increase in coal-fired generation is taking place in non-OECD Asia. So, we have to make energy affordable while we're making the transition. And if we've learned nothing from the catastrophe of Donald Trump and yellow vests and other movements, is that populist sentiment can really undo politics very quickly. So we've got to manage that transition. So, in Asia, zeroing in on OECD and developing Asia, as you heard from Secretary Kamian, the administration is going to try and partner on technology, how to promote carbon capture, how to promote hydrogen, how to promote electric vehicles, and decarbonization of heavy industry. You've seen this First Movers Coalition, which is really looking at all of these heavy industries that have to take significant and challenging steps to decarbonize and trying to move them forward. But it's also going to have to do better on assuring the reliability of U.S. natural gas. And we've had one statement from Jen Psaki, the press secretary, saying, yes, we still realize LNG imports are important, but U.S. LNG makes gas affordable. It creates a competitive marketplace. It's a source of energy security and reliable, particularly for Japan and for Korea, and increasingly even China. There's a new Venture Global agreement with China. So, the administration is going to need to kind of declare that they understand that and have a domestic pathway for permitting natural gas infrastructure, at the same time requiring that there be better disclosure on what those impacts are. Even competing with China on the world stage, we're seeing from the administration that they're going to use development assistance to try and compete with the Belt and Road Initiative, not in terms of dollars, but in terms of leveraging private investment. And there's a little bit of wiggle room there for energy security and for gas and other places. But I think countries are going to want to know whether the U.S. is going to help with that part of the energy transition. And as we heard the administration's goals, but given the commitments that we have from NDCs right now, we're not on a path to 1.5. And so we've got a lot of work to do. The NDCs that are submitted only cover about half the world's global emissions and population. And so, we've still got to deal with coal. Coal is really still king in Asia. And so the U.S. is going to need to take some steps to do that. I would say, lastly, I know the world is waiting to see whether the U.S. is going to live up to its commitment. Do we have our own domestic plan? Are we really going to compete on the world stage, or are we in a period of withdrawal? And I think what you're hearing from the administration and what you will see is that the administration is serious about the U.S. target. We'll see what comes out, but through regulation, through legislation, through market force incentive, we're going to get it done. Maybe it's not going to get done in the next 3 months, but we're going to get that done. And I think the U.S. is serious about competing constructively with China on the world stage in terms of helping other countries develop frameworks that are going to be attractive for private investment and driving that private investment in a variety of ways. So I'm optimistic. I'm mostly optimistic because I think markets are driving this transition. And as always, I think it'll happen faster than the target once the target is clear. And these 2030 targets are really helping accelerate deployment and change. But the key thing that has to change, and this is what the Energy Resources Bureau is all about, is we've got to get the framework right in Asia to attract that private investment and everywhere else in the world. And that's where we really rely on governments. The U.S. is there to help them get those frameworks right. But there is a huge amount of money. ESG funds are just full of cash looking for places to invest. But the framework has to be right. And so we can develop those regulatory frameworks. People can make money investing in clean energy in OECD and developing Asia. I think they're going to be rushing to get there because that's where the future is. So I think we'll get it done here at home. Hopefully we'll get it done abroad as well. It's just going to be bumpy and it's probably not going to be quick. Thanks, Randy.
David, really appreciate your optimism here. It is we're both sitting here in Washington, but watching. It is ugly to see how this sausage is getting made. But you're convinced that one way or another we will get this done, and I appreciate that. I'm looking forward to seeing what happens today on the Hill. Now, a couple questions before we go to the next panelist. So first, earlier this year, you published an Atlantic Council issue brief, which everyone should go and read, on how the Biden administration should build a better international coalition on energy and climate policy. So can you talk about what you've seen in the administration taking steps in that direction in the Asia Pacific region, and where is there room for improvement?
Sure, Randy, thanks. And I think in that brief, which I co-authored with Andrea Clabo, another senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, we anticipated it was going to be a bumpy road because of the tight majorities. But in terms of building those coalitions, it's interesting. This is really what John Kerry has been focused on as much as anything else. It's working with private sector companies in order to accelerate investment. That's what the First Movers Coalition is about, and others. So I think what the U.S. you're going to see us do is first provide a reassurance on energy security. I think they're going to have to do that. That supply is going to be there. I think you're going to see these coalitions on hydrogen technology and carbon capture and on electric vehicles, technological partnerships coming from the Department of Energy and wrapping in all the countries to share what we know and engage in joint projects. I think you're going to see that move forward as well. I think you're seeing the leveraging of APEC and of the G20 and of other coalitions to try and create coalitions together. The key thing that we need to do in this collective effort is show the rest of the world the money. And that's where the contribution, to the global funds as well as U.S. direct development assistance are going to be key. And I think that's going to be in the package, because it's not really highly disputed, but it'll be great if it's included in that top line number when the president goes to Glasgow, because that's really going to grease the wheels of all of these partnerships. Is if we have money for pilot projects, for seed development, and if we can really share what our national labs are doing, that's going to make for a better coalition.
Got it. Thank you. I want to move to the geopolitics for a second, and the geopolitics and energy security. So how does the current energy crisis and the U.S.'s sort of, what's the right word I want to use here, somewhat schizophrenic view of how to approach this, with some folks obviously saying that the answer is just more renewables and that will overcome the sort of commodity cycle, and other folks saying, in the short term, we really need to make sure that gas is available, folks like you. How does that appear to the outside world when we're just so uncertain about how we approach this? And how does that impact our ability to act on climate, act on energy security, and really manage sort of our international relationships that in the Asia Pacific, which are so crucial right now, because as we think about the role of China growing in the region?
Well, the administration has been in a tough place because they're trying to manage international expectations on Glasgow. They're trying to manage a very difficult coalition on the Hill. They're trying to manage the progressive wing of the Democratic Party and these geopolitical relationships. So what they've been talking about is renewables and promoting renewables. And they've been pretty silent on gas and on hydrocarbons because they don't want to create any doubt going into Glasgow that they are 100% behind this movement, and no matter what happens, they're going forward. So that's understandable. But it has created confusion because they also want security of supply, because high gasoline prices are not good for any president. And if you're promoting renewables, but you're also asking OPEC to increase production, that can seem a little inconsistent, both probably to energy producers, and to others. And that's kind of a political reality. I don't have any doubt that, the Brian Deeses and Ron Klains of the world understand that you need to have affordable energy through this transition. And I think you've heard Secretary Haaland and others say, we're not going to stop U.S. energy production. We just don't know whether we need to put government money into promoting it. We don't need to increase federal lands to invest in it. So it does create some confusion. And I think after Glasgow, the messaging will be a little bit more consistent. But there is a consistent thread in here, which is that government money is going to go into promoting the energy transition. Government regulation is going to accelerate it. You still need hydrocarbons in the meantime. And the hope is that private companies, as you're hearing from BP and from Equinor and from others, are going to recycle those funds into the energy transition as you go forward. So it is a little inconsistent. And as I said earlier, I think in the coming months, the administration is going to have to do better on public diplomacy and describe a little bit more that the U.S. will remain a low carbon, low cost, and reliable provider of hydrocarbons, especially and particularly natural gas, because it is important to the energy transition. And I think it's going to be critical that we're going to continue producing it, but we're going to do it in a much cleaner way. So they're going to have to do both, but it is creating some confusion right now. And I think particularly for Japan, Korea, Thailand, Taiwan, and China, they're going to need to send that signal that the US will be there and will be reliable for energy security and geopolitical reasons, because if we're not, China is there with coal. And so we face some real competition. So it's a tough political tight wire to walk, but I think they'll have a little bit better balance after Glasgow.
David, thank you. Now pivoting to Rich. Rich Powell, the Executive Director of ClearPath. Rich, maybe you could also just give everybody a bit of background on what ClearPath is, because as David alluded to, we're starting to see more climate policies from the right in the United States, and I think that would be a good thing to get your perspective on that.
Sure. Well, huge thanks, Randy. Let me start just by thanking the Atlantic Council and Singapore International Energy Week at SemCorp for sponsoring this fantastic event, this fantastic discussion. I had the pleasure to work in Singapore on global energy development earlier in my career, and have very fond memories from working in the region with its unique opportunities and its unique challenges. My organization, ClearPath, is a US-based, Washington, DC-based think tank and advocacy organization focused on advancing conservative policies that accelerate energy innovation in the power and industrial sectors. So as Randy mentioned, we work primarily with conservative policymakers and take a more conservative approach to scaling up the technologies that we believe will be very helpful in solving the global climate challenge. And we do indeed see it as a very global challenge. Today, I'll talk quickly about three things. First, about the global landscape, which does show rapidly increasing carbon emissions, particularly driven by activities in China, and how we ought to think about that as a framework for solving the problem. Second, how an innovation-driven agenda is the way to actually help us solve this global emissions challenge. And third, how I think we can build on the recent bipartisan success here in the United States of advancing an innovation-driven climate agenda, and how that actually could help more thoroughly address emissions from the rapidly developing Asian Pacific, for example. So first, on that global landscape, while the US has reversed our emissions trajectory along with a handful of other countries in the past decade and a half, the rest of the world continues to grow. Growth in emissions now through 2050 by developing Asian countries alone will exceed total US emissions today. So while it's extremely important for the US to continue and deepen our emissions reduction trajectory, unless that emissions increase in the rest of the world is arrested, we simply won't see a diminishment in the global risk of climate change. That's just unfortunately how the global climate math works. And existing technology does not appear to be up to the task of this economy-wide decarbonization. While there have been remarkable developments in the cost profile of intermittent wind and solar, those technologies are at best keeping pace with global energy development. They're not actually expanding their share of global energy usage. And until they do that radically, until all clean energy technologies radically increase their share of global energy consumption, we're not going to see a decrease in global emissions. I'll just share one specific example in the region where I also lived and worked, and that's Indonesia. I don't need to say much to this audience about the degree to which Indonesia is vulnerable to climate impacts. Jakarta, the second largest metropolitan area on Earth after Tokyo, is sinking in part due to sea level rise. More than 70% of the city was submerged back in one monsoon in 2007 alone. Maintaining a metropolis like Jakarta will require incredible investments in resilient infrastructure, stronger urban planning, and better technology to limit and eventually reverse global climate change. Indonesia broadly will soon be the third most population on Earth, will eclipse the United States as the largest economy in the region, and decarbonizing such a complex economy is going to require breakthrough technologies. The 275 million Indonesians live across 6,000 islands in the world's most populous archipelago. The population density there is 4 times as high as in the US. Java, obviously the country's most populous island, is densely settled, but is less inhabited than many parts of other islands, which are home to the largest remaining rainforests in Southeast Asia. In short, Indonesia is incredibly rich in culture and biodiversity and quite poor in open, available land. Ensuring that a clean energy future for Indonesia will rely heavily on power-dense clean energy sources, things like advanced nuclear, fossils with carbon capture, hydrogen, and enhanced geothermal, many of which the government is already exploring, but all of which are really only under development today. And despite the best of intentions and significant recent progress, for example, what Secretary Kamian mentioned with rooftop solar deployment in Vietnam, relying 100% on existing high land use variable carbon-free sources like wind and solar is entirely unrealistic in Indonesia, as it is for much of the rest of the Asian Pacific. And obviously, to make matters more complicated, Indonesia's islands and much of the rest of the Asia Pacific is rich in coal. Indonesia alone is the second largest coal exporter by value on the planet, and its share of power generation from coal continues to grow in both absolute and relative terms. It's now roughly 60% as it rapidly electrifies its economy. Despite all the continued cost improvements, again, in wind and solar, countries with high population density and abundant coal looking to rapidly electrify continue to turn to that power source as it remains cheap, abundant, and reliable. So the climate challenge for Indonesia is a microcosm of the wider region. And as we've discussed today, the current energy crisis across the region is only exacerbating these challenges. Coal consumption in virtually every country is increased, and plans for expanded facilities without carbon capture are in many cases back on the books. So coming back to how US climate policy could actually help the region deal with these unique challenges, first and foremost, we must have an innovation agenda to radically cut the cost of clean energy for developing countries. Again, we're seeing no increase today in the share of primary energy demand from clean sources. First, we have to realize why coal has been so appealing. I mean, last year alone, China brought 38 gigawatts of coal online, more than 3 times the rest of the world combined. They've historically been the largest public financier of coal plants globally. They've recently committed to changing this, but we prefer to watch what they do, not what they say. So the Belt and Road Initiative has made it cheap and easy for developing countries to electrify their economies by building new coal plants. And that's because coal is extremely well known. It's cheap and reliable. It's popular and, more importantly, familiar with leading energy decision makers in the region. And it's relatively low risk for a policymaker to take that on. If we want to see a change in that, we must provide energy policymakers with better alternatives. Today, that's natural gas. US and others have incredibly abundant gas reserves. After a boomlet, though, in US LNG export facilities a few years ago, new facilities struggled to find long-term stable offtake agreements in the most recent years to secure the financing to further expand. Perhaps now this energy crisis will change that and allow further export facility expansion in the US and in other players. That remains to be seen, and to be seen how long the current crisis and the current elevated demand levels are. Tomorrow, though, that needs to be substitutes that go beyond gas, but substitutes, real like-for-like substitutes for subcritical coal. That means that they're cheap, highly reliable, quick to build, and easy to site, all while being 100% clean. And finally, we must use all available levers to hold China to their word on ending global coal financing and to severely limit the growth of their domestic coal financing and domestic coal build. I believe we can do that. I believe that the US can build on its recent, strong, bipartisan, technology neutral record of clean energy innovation. We need to do 4 things from the US perspective. First, we need to deepen our commitment on innovation. We've had recent tremendous wins, things like the Energy Act of 2020, which sets up a Manhattan-style project for demonstrating these advanced low land use, power-dense clean energy sources like advanced nuclear and fossils with carbon capture, hydrogen, geothermal, et cetera. Second, we need to work on our regulatory constraints inside the United States so we can actually build these things quickly enough to rapidly bring down their cost and actually benefit the rest of the world. Third, we need to demonstrate how these work in the US so that the rest of the world actually can look at things that are realistic and have actually been deployed somewhere. And last, we need to be much more serious about exporting this technology to the rest of the world. We're finally coming back through our Export-Import Bank, which has been reauthorized and has started to cut deals again around the world. Currently, though, the authorizations for EXIM in the United States are shackled by only particularly supporting variable renewable energy. We need to put more technologies on a level playing field at our Export-Import Bank. There have been good developments on that at our Development Finance Corporation, which has a much expanded scope, new authorities, more ability to do equity financing as well, and most recently has taken on a more technology neutral approach by ending its ban on financing nuclear. The U.S. also needs to work through the multilateral institutions where we play a leading role and push those further into clean energy, and again unnshackle them to focus to allow more technologies. We really need to end the restriction on nuclear finance at the World Bank, for example. All of these things can happen. They can happen in a bipartisan way. Partisan climate policy is simply not sustainable, and we need to move to a broader, more inclusive approach going forward to all this, building on the recent bipartisan energy wins like the Energy Act of 2020. So just in summary, I'll say again, we need to keep the entire global picture in mind when we're thinking about US climate policy. We need to promote technologies that actually offer a like-for-like substitute for low-cost subcritical coal for the developing world. And we need to build more on bipartisanship within the US. Thanks.
Rich, thank you. It sounds like you and David agree on a whole lot, which is unusual for Washington, D.C. So I want to ask you a question about about 2023. So in 2023, imagine that what seems incredibly likely, Republicans take back the House and possibly also the Senate, more likely than not. What does climate policy look like in Washington in 2023, and how does that impact the region?
Yeah, well, so first, just as a reminder for anybody watching from out of the region who doesn't follow our crazy seesaw politics as closely, we have a midterm election coming up at the end of next year. Typically in the U.S., in midterm elections, the control of Congress swings back away from the sitting president. So, if past is prologue, Republicans in the House, for example, in our House of Representatives, are likely to pick up, somewhere between 15 and 30 seats, which would give them control of the House. The Senate is a lot harder. We can all take out our crystal ball to try to see what that looks like, but it's less clear. But I think that we're likely to be in divided government going forward in the next few years. I think that there are folks who will throw up their hands and say that's the end of U.S. climate policy leadership. That's the end of the story that will walk away once we're back into divided government. Those folks will not have been paying attention over the past two Congresses to what we've accomplished under either conservative controlled government or divided government. We've actually had some of the largest clean energy policy wins in over a decade in the US in that divided government. Again, things culminating in the Energy Act of 2020. I myself am helping to lead a delegation of Republican policymakers to the COP in Glasgow next week. Republicans want to come back to the table. Congressional Republicans want to come back to the table and be engaged in global climate policy. They have significant specific differences with their Democratic counterparts about how global climate engagement should look, but they want to be at the table. They want the US to be engaged globally. And they are certainly committed to this innovation agenda. So seeing through this vast wave of demonstrations for new advanced technology in the United States, they're very committed to incentives and it's sort of a carrot and incentive-based policy to encourage new technologies to come into the system. And they are certainly quite committed to making deep investments in US competitiveness relative to China. They're serious about getting under control the potential serious human rights abuses in parts of the Chinese supply chains, whether that's on building solar panels using forced labor in Western China, or on global control of critical minerals. So I think that these are all really good things for continued U.S. deep engagement in global climate policy. So I'd say it'll be more of an evolution than a revolution.
Got it. Thank you. Now, one final question before we go to Ashley. So, where, from your perspective, let's say from the general perspective of the group that you are bringing to the COP next week, where do you think they see the successes of the Biden administration's policies, particularly in the Asia Pacific, and where would you encourage a different approach? Where do you see missed opportunities or an approach that's not as effective?
Yeah, well, so I think first we talked a little bit earlier about the sort of the schizophrenia and both wanting to say we've got in the near term energy crisis scenario, a robust, affordable, reliable energy supply chain and this total transition. I think it's been a real misstep to say we're going to limit development of hydrocarbons in the US, but then encourage, in many cases, global competitors to increase their share of hydrocarbon production. That's not only something that's kind of unfair to the US economy and diminishes US global competitiveness, it also quite possibly has negative climate impacts. So US hydrocarbon production is amongst the cleanest hydrocarbon production on the planet. So encouraging that to shift away and more of it to be taken up by very, very high emission Russian production, for example, I think it seems to be a serious misstep, both on the actual climate impacts of the decisions and U.S. economic competitiveness, and frankly, just political willingness to go forward with the climate transition. So I think that has been a misstep. I will say I think a lot of conservatives have been heartened to see Democrats coming back to nuclear energy, and that this administration has been fairly committed. So a number of the bilateral agreements that Secretary Kerry has worked out on his world tour these last couple of months include opportunities for expanded collaboration, whether that's on nuclear innovation or actually even just building large scale new nuclear facilities, less in the Asia Pacific, but in Ukraine, for example, that's been on the table. And so my understanding is that's been on the table for all of these discussions. And I think continuing that approach of focusing on a broader suite of low carbon technologies, particularly ones that conservatives are more confident could actually be deployed in really, really populous, land poor countries, I think is another good step that this administration has made.
Rich, thank you. And I think we should be watching this space over the coming weeks for announcements, nuclear, potentially even in the Asia Pacific. So thank you. I want to pivot to Ashley now. Ashley, thank you for joining us. Over to you for your remarks, and then we'll soon get into a robust discussion. I know I have more questions for David and Rich, and I'm sure I will for you.
Great. Thank you so much, Randy, and greetings, everyone. It's a pleasure to join this session as part of Singapore International Energy Week. This is a very major conference for those in our field, so it's exciting to be a part of this. My thanks to the organizers and to the Atlantic Council for including me in the discussion. One of the benefits of going at the end of the speaker list is that I get to point to a number of the comments and observations made by my co-panelists. So thank you very much, David and Rich. We're actually, I think, all in agreement. So this might be an interesting discussion, Randy, as we go into the Q&A session. But I'll pull in some of my own thoughts that do tie it to other comments that have been made. But as we consider the impacts of this administration's energy and climate policies on our partners in Asia, I wanted to focus on two general areas. The first, some brief thoughts on the landscape of some of the US government agencies and the opportunities for bilateral cooperation. And as that plays out in Asia, some of the opportunities that our partners can look to in a post-COP world. And the second is giving some thoughts on specific fuel-related policies. David and I worked together on a natural gas program earlier this year. So again, some similar thoughts here, but we'll add a few additional comments as well. This is certainly not an exhaustive list, and basing a lot of this off of a number of different programs and conversations through the region. But as we do look beyond COP26, we have an idea of what a successful COP conference looks like, what an outcome for the United States would be, what that would be meaningful and impactful for our colleagues in Asia. But I think it's also important to note that if we are unable to reach consensus here in the United States and in the broader Conference of the Parties discussions, this is not new. It's not a good outcome, but it's not a new outcome. And the US has notoriously been unable or unwilling in some cases to ratify international agreements for action on climate change. But I think we're seeing a number of some of the alternative avenues for cooperation, both within the government and externally. The private sector is going to come up, rapidly increasing as ways that we can continue these conversations and meaningful actions outside of these larger conversations. Within the US government, a number of agencies have their own mandate as they try to work on some of these clean energy transitions. Obviously, we heard from Department of State, Commerce, USAID. The Asia Edge initiative more broadly is working on a number of these programs. And to echo some of the points that David was making, I hear a lot of questions about the US government agencies and aren't they beholden to administration changes in policy? And while that is often the case, a lot of what is happening is being driven by the private sector and market-based realities. And I think that's really important, again, to highlight, even though I know it was brought up earlier, is that this allows for projects to be driven by what is marketable and feasible in the economies in the region. And I think what we've seen over the past several years that even though natural gas markets and policies have been more favorable, and we do see an increase there, we are seeing a lot of proposals and projects being sought from organizations like the Development Finance Corporation, the US Trade and Development Agency, that do focus on renewable energy and some of the cleaner fuel options that exist. So we are seeing that transition happening already, and outside of some of the larger conversations on policy. The other thing I would note is that public-private partnerships are really important tools in the US government toolkit. This is something that you'll hear repeatedly in conversations. And I also want to stress that for our colleagues in Asia, this is something that I think is really helpful in trying to shape some trajectories so that even if we see some ongoing debates internally in the US on what our own policies might be, a lot of these different programs, these opportunities for financing, really are wanting to match the resources that we have with the realities and needs on the ground. And I think that's a really important conversation in ways that we can drive the efforts, the innovation strategies to really focus on what we need and how we want to get to the targets, even if it isn't in the broader conversations again of COP. I think it's also important to stress the strategic energy partnerships that we have. This is another important part of our own efforts. We have numerous with Japan, relatively new strategic energy partnership with India, and then some other less energy focused, but still I think important for these conversations like the Quad. So we look to mini laterals or the new US-ASEAN strategic partnership. Those might not be energy specific, but they certainly have implications for energy security and climate financing as part of the latter that I just mentioned. So I'd also want to note that there are ways that we can continue in less kind of the higher level multilateral ways to have these conversations in slightly smaller forums. Then as I turn to some specific fuels, I think there are obviously a number of questions of what changing US policy means for countries in which we trade energy supplies or have partnerships with. One thing that has been a key talking point the past several years in the US and in conversations in Asia is the importance of an all of the above strategy. This is something that we've kind of talked about in our past two presentations as well. This all of the above strategy does often have negative connotations for some of the climate actions that we see from those who are really trying to rapidly scale down the use of fossil fuels, but as it also kind of plays out in the energy security space, there are a lot of realities that we are having to deal with in terms of the most recent supply crunch and kind of the existing infrastructure of how do we manage the transition from large scale coal and gas plants and transitioning those to maybe things that are working on hydrogen or then moving it to renewables. And so there's a lot of questions on stranded assets and energy security that I think will continue to shape some of these conversations on fuel specific policies. Natural gas, of course, I'll keep my remarks on this brief, but we've seen quite a bit of change within the Obama administration. We saw an increase in natural gas and LNG exports. Under the Trump administration, that was certainly a critical tool in the trade policy toolkit and expanding our own economic benefits from natural gas exports, but also helping with some energy security concerns. And then now with the restrictions on new development on federal lands, there's still opportunities though for natural gas here. And I think as David had mentioned, we still see this being an important fuel in Asia, but I would also note that it's not necessarily the same across the region. So as we do kind of navigate some of these questions of Japan and Korea, for example, will continue to have relatively high natural gas percentages given the lack of ability to expand renewable energy in the same capacity that some other countries might. India, for example, has been implementing extremely ambitious renewable energy capacity. And some say that natural gas won't have as big of a role in India as it is currently projected to play because they've been able to leapfrog. And I think that does also push us to talk about the financing question of how we're helping with some of these transitions, how the multilateral development banks are restricting their own funding on fossil fuels, but what is the alternative? As Rich mentioned, do we look at nuclear? I think we have a good argument for we should. But there are certainly questions on how we're financing these transitions. If we want to limit the use of fossil fuels, where is that funding coming from? The private sector has ample money. As we mentioned, the ESG availability is rampant, but making sure that we actually get those funds deployed and are actually able to help countries navigate that transition if they want to kind of leapfrog some of the more carbon intensive options to renewable energy. And then the last thing I think I'll make, and then we'll welcome some questions, Randy, is on the end of renewables, some policies here in the US that I think are going to have important implications for Asia. One is the supply chain question. Obviously, this is one that we've discussed. The pandemic and the recent energy crunch show really the impacts of massive disruptions in our global economy. In the US and many other countries in Asia do lack the capability to source these critical minerals for renewable energy technologies, batteries, and that will play out how we're able to continue to accelerate our efforts here. And we'll have some really important geopolitical and trade questions in the coming months and years. I'd also like to comment on the Made in America kind of trade policies that we're seeing. This, I think, does have some really important implications for these efforts as we look at ways that we're trying to increase US-based manufacturing, increase better jobs for US workers, what that might mean for things like electric vehicles. As we look at parts need to be, I think it's higher than 50%. I know that number has been elevated somewhat recently of those parts being made in the US by US workers. That does have implications for our partners in Asia, companies that might be based here in the US, but aren't necessarily using union workers to make electric vehicles, and how that might play out as we're trying to ramp up our own electric vehicle and low emission transportation sector here in the United States. And the last point I'll want to talk about is the question of critical minerals, jumping back to this, on climate justice and equitable transitions. David mentioned this briefly in his remarks, but this is a key aspect of this administration's policy. It's kind of, I think, one of the first times we're really seeing it at the federal level. This has, of course, been a regular conversation in indigenous communities and grassroots organizations, but this was a big part of the Biden administration campaign. And I think that is going to really come to the forefront as we're working on extraction of critical minerals and where are we sourcing these supplies from? How are we getting them? Does it impact communities in Asia, around the world, but also communities here in the US as we're kind of looking to expand our own solar, wind, coal, gas, whatever kind of plant it might be. So I think that is going to be another key factor going forward. And I will stop there.
Ashley, thank you so much. A couple questions that I want to pick up on from your remarks. So first, you used the word leapfrogging. And I want to dig a little bit deeper into that and see if you think that there's actually an opportunity to for some countries in the region to sort of jump ahead, as it were, and skip some of the hydrocarbon development that we've seen that really provided energy to the West. Or if that metaphor, which you often use the cell phone metaphor, if that's overplayed and not really feasible at the moment. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, and if it's real in certain places and not others, et cetera.
I think that's a great question. Thank you, Randy. It's less real in the way that we want it to be. I think India is a really good case of a country that has been rapidly deploying renewable energy, and to the extent that they really might not need gas as much as they have projected it to be in their power mix, and can really work to meet the demand that they have projected. But I think then the challenge there is the coal still exists in the case of India. And it's not necessarily, in this case, replacing coal. It's not allowing natural gas to be developed. And I think in many ways, this is the ideal. If we could all just go from what we have now with no new build of fossil fuels, and it's just clean energy with no repercussions of the impacts of mining and some of the supply chain tensions. And there's a lot there I think we can discuss. So I think in many cases, it wouldn't solve the initial problem. It might bypass a few of the other challenges that we discuss in terms of stranded assets and other issues. If we're going to build a new plant that lasts for 40 years, but we want to build out renewables within the next 10, what happens for the remainder of the next 30 years of that plant? It maybe can help address some of those near term, but it doesn't, I think, solve the existing challenge that we have of what already exists and how can we switch that over, I guess, if that answers your question.
Got it. Thank you. One other question before we go to a broader discussion. You mentioned trade, and it's a huge issue. We see this being dramatically shaping the climate conversation over the coming years. Europe is working on their carbon border adjustment. There is a bill right now, Senator Coons has introduced. That it's probably unworkable in its current form, but it's definitely carbon border adjustment in one way, shape, or form is on the agenda for Europe and the United States and other countries. How is that being viewed in the region, and how would that impact the region if some version of this is implemented?
The carbon border adjustment conversation, I think, is really interesting. I've seen a few proposed. I think South Korea was looking at a potential carbon border adjustment that was looking similar to the EU model. But I think generally it wouldn't be favorable. I mean, as we look at trade policies in general, this does raise prices. I mean, it does have impact on companies that might be trying to do business here. What does that mean for those who have been high importers to the United States? But also, I think in the US, there's some questions of what that means for consumers. And as you've mentioned, there's some questions on the current outline of the bill here in the United States. I think it's an important strategy for us to consider as we do try to place pressure in some ways on maybe industries that are particularly high polluting. And I think that's certainly an avenue that we should consider. But it doesn't, there are questions of, again, the equitable level of what that adjustment might be. Do you have a blanket policy? And if you do, how does that impact a country like Indonesia versus a country like Japan, which both are very strong economies, but at slightly different levels? And how does that play out, I think, is going to cause some trade challenges as we do try to negotiate future bilateral or multilateral deals in the region, but also here at home of how we kind of manage both the expectations domestically, but with those key partners in the region.
Got it. Thank you. Well, I want to pivot now to the broader conversation. Again, for those of you watching online, feel free to ask questions through the app, and I'm monitoring it, and we'll try to get to as many of these as we can. I want to start with the sort of toughest challenge that we're facing in sort of climate from the U.S. in climate and sort of geopolitics in the region, which is China, with an increasing what's the word I want to use? Well, the rhetoric is ramping up against China in a bipartisan way, but at the same time, we all recognize we need to work with China on climate and emissions issues. How should the U.S. approach China while trying to manage its emissions and get them to be part of global climate commitments, while at the same time making sure to manage the geopolitical tensions? So why don't we first go to Ashley and we'll work backwards for Ashley, Rich, and then David.
This is the question.
It's a hard question. Yeah.
Yeah.
I know.
I mean, many are going to be familiar with the debates of, do we engage with China and look past some conversations of human rights abuses, of really serious concerns in other areas, to find ways to cooperate on climate? And I think I might lean a little bit more, well, as we look at the impacts of climate change and the dire need that we face, the U.S. has to have very substantial action. China has to have substantial action. These are the two most pivotal countries, and I think we do need to find ways to engage with China. I think in order to address some of the major concerns that we do have with economic policies, with human rights policies, this is where our partners in the region are really critical. And this is hard because we're asking a lot, particularly when a lot of these economies depend on China. This is one of their major trading partners that has very large impact on their own development. But we cannot take on China alone. From the US side, we really do, I think, need to work with partners like Japan, Australia, countries in Southeast Asia to bring this issue to the forefront of finding ways that we can cooperate in this space, because we're on a very limited timeline in terms of what we have available. And so I think trying to find ways that we can partner with other countries in the region, countries across the world even, to kind of help find a strategy that can get us all to 1.5 degree, I think is really important. So I would say that working with our partners in the region, making sure that there are ways that it's not just a US-led approach, that we do consider other perspectives in these conversations is really important. But I think we do need to move quickly and find ways that we can cooperate.
Ashley, thank you. Rich, your thoughts?
I'll just add, align myself with everything Ashley just said on that. This is extremely tricky. I'll add two additional areas. One, China is not just China, right? It's so active in the region on financing and building and contracting and operating energy infrastructure. We in the U.S. in the past decade have somewhat abandoned the region in terms of new build of energy infrastructure. That was due to a bunch of self-inflicted wounds, like not reauthorizing our Export-Import Bank. Our development finance infrastructure remains very reactive. It sort of waits for deals to come to it, as opposed to going out and seeking those deals in the world. There's no one at fault right now in the U.S. government if the next power plant that Vietnam chooses to build is a coal plant as opposed to a solar farm or a nuclear plant. There's no one who's responsible for that right now in our government, and we certainly don't have anything like the all of government coordinated, public-private partnership approach that China has had to advancing its, economic control, its infrastructure control, its energy interests in the region. We could have that, right? We could have a much more coordinated approach amongst all of the different agencies and financing institutions in our government. It could be working very closely with our private sector. I think it could be doing it in a smarter way than China has been doing. I think there could be, we could be taking on fewer of the really high risk situations, doing less of the infrastructure that'll never be paid off, but still doing it in a way that significantly changes the emissions trajectory and just gives a better set of options for rapidly developing countries in the region. I mean, I don't besmirch any country for building a subcritical coal plant if they, just need to rapidly electrify their population and improve everybody's quality of life, and if they don't have any better options, and we are not providing them those better options in any kind of systematic way today. So that's one thing. The second thing is, I think we shouldn't forget about the power of our private sector and the voluntary commitments and action that our private sector can change even within China. So if you take a look at Walmart, for example, and its Project Gigaton, it's gone all the way back up its supply chain, which obviously much of which stretches into Chinese manufacturing, and has started to hold specific facilities and specific manufacturers accountable to delivering emissions reductions way up its supply chain. And so I think that there's a lot that the global importers in the US could be doing in a voluntary way. It's a little softer of an approach, but there's a lot of options in China, and you can choose amongst which factories are going to manufacture your widgets, and you could be choosing to use the ones that are more efficient, running off cleaner energy, et cetera. So I think there's a lot that we could do there, and a lot we should be encouraging our private sector to do as well.
Rich, thank you.
I think some great points both by Ashley and Rich there. I mean, I think the first thing to keep in mind is it isn't all about us. It isn't all about the US. China's emissions are a risk, particularly to countries in the regions and worldwide. And I think Ashley's point about multilateralizing, both the effort to hold China to its commitments, but also multilateralizing collaboration on clean energy technology and and trade is really important. Now, I think we do need some better tools, and I think this is what Rich was talking about. Companies are going to try and decarbonize their value chains, but it really helps when governments do too. So if the US were to rejoin CPTPP and we could have global trading rules on clean energy technology and carbon, that would be great. It's probably politically a bridge too far right now, but I think that this idea that consumers and governments are going to start rating the carbon footprint of trade, I think is really important. Having common metrics that are accepted by industry, that are accepted by governments, is the way forward. Because if we all start rating that carbon footprint, then what we can, as we can multilateralize, is the idea that we're going to count and score, and we are going to, as countries, meet our NDCs, all of us, by accessing the lowest carbon, export or import that we can find, and that will allow us to compete. It will allow industry to compete to be low carbon, and that's the dynamic that needs to shift. So a government collaboration with private industry to establish global metrics, that helps. Trade agreements, sectoral agreements on clean energy technology trade, I think will all help, because the way this US-China rivalry is going to be more of a global China rivalry is by creating an opportunity where those who are low carbon win. Their economies prosper better. They attract more investment. And I think the ESG money is pushing in that direction, but you need government frameworks to support that. And we heard it from Harry Kamen at the micro level. We need it at the macro level. And so, trade is such a dirty word for both parties right now, but trade is really, I think, going to be the answer. And it's going to be the action forcing tool that will enable governments like the US government, which doesn't want to do a carbon tax, to have a quasi carbon trading agreement, by competing for who gets the lowest carbon value chain.
David, thank you. That's getting back into the trade question, very, very tricky. I want to pivot to the other big elephant in the room, which is India, which just yesterday said that they will not make a net zero pledge going into Glasgow. And I'd love everybody's thoughts on that. And again, why don't we just go in order? Ashley, Rich, and David.
In many ways, it is disappointing that we won't see a net zero pledge from India. It is a very large emitter, but it is a part of that their per capita emissions are so low. Now, that does raise very important questions of when we get to 2030, 2050, and we continue to have energy access expanded with more reliable electricity, do those per capita emissions rise? And that is, I know, what we're trying to address with many of the clean energy transitions, the massively scaling up of renewables. So it is, again, as we see this consortium of countries going forward and trying to do these really ambitious plans, and to see India not have one like that is in some ways very discouraging. But I do think it's also important to point to what they have accomplished. And I think that was, in the past several years, a lot of comments that I've heard is that no one thought that India would meet its gigawatt targets, the 175, and we're really up on an upward trajectory here. And I think that is something that is worth noting, that even if we don't have a net zero pledge, there is enough significant other activities happening in the country that I think are really important to consider as we do go into these conversations. Because at the end of the day, if they are working on specific actions, they are deploying these resources, trying to find new ways to make it more reliable, to better connect the grids, reduce some of the inefficiencies. I think that is a really important part of that story.
Thank you, Rich.
Yeah, I'll say I'm aligned with Ashley. It's hard to criticize India for refusing to do this, given their per capita emissions. It's in some sense really unfair to hold a country with that level of development to this same standard. We should remember we've made a net zero commitment in the United States. We're even not entirely sure how we're going to accomplish that, and that we have all the technology to accomplish that. So asking someone who is a rapidly developing economy of very continued problems just with basic electrification for some parts of the country, or reliable electrification, I should say, it's quite a thing to ask. I do agree that they've made remarkable domestic strides just on deployment. Obviously, they need to do more, could be doing more. Again, I think it's a place where we should be finding every potential opportunity to work with them, right? So clearly they've got something really strong going here with domestic renewables deployment, right? They still have a massive coal base. They actually have a substantial enhanced oil recovery opportunity, which captured CO2 could go into helping them develop in some regions of the country, and that would, by the way, help their wild imbalance on oil imports versus domestic production. I think we need to get more creative about how we can find ways that are wins for an economy that in the long run is really gonna own the at least the second half of the 21st century, and finding ways to do that so that we in the long run develop a much better relationship there, or maintain a much better relationship there, obviously, than we currently have with China.
And David.
Well, I think it is disappointing that India hasn't made that commitment, but I think it does point out the political management challenge that every government has in trying to sell the energy transition to its public. And as Rich pointed out, we're having that challenge here as well. I mean, India still has, this extremely high level of agricultural subsidies. It has a weak federal system. It has, basically a terrible distribution system of electricity where there's no cash in the system. So they're underinvested in both power transmission and in gas transportation. So the pathway for carbon reduction in India, which is to substitute gas for coal and to increase the capacity utilization of renewables, which is at maybe sub 50% right now, even where they have, installed capacity of wind and solar. Those are all national problems. You've got to change the national framework to enable people to make money providing electricity in India to create cash in the system to build all this out. We can't do it from the outside in, and no US developer is going to want to build a power plant in India unless it's in a state where you can get a cost recoverable tariff and you have a consumer, which is why Gujarat is so, has been more successful than the others. So India is going to be a top runner strategy. There are states that are going to attract investment and succeed, and there are others which are hopefully going to emulate them. What is disappointing is that Modi has not used his tremendous political power to try and build a stronger federal solution, to this problem. So I think where there is a good system, the US ought to be flexible about using development finance to invest in gas transportation or in transmission. But it's really the framework which needs to change in India. And we'll find the states that are the winners and hope that technology provides them with cheaper solutions. But the real problem is the framework. And until that gets fixed, it's hard for any solution, technological or traditional, to be really accessible to India. And that's where it's a tough political balance that Modi has to strike to sustain. They can't absorb the cost of that investment, and they can't impose the cost of the transition, and the outside world just can't write them a check. So it's going to be slow and incremental, and that's too bad. But there probably isn't another pathway.
Thanks all. Very, very interesting and helpful. We did have a question from the audience, and I want to go to Rich first on this because Rich has mentioned the development finance institutions in the U.S. now are sort of getting back up to speed. But the question from Brian Pham is what areas offer the best opportunity for U.S. and Asia to work together to advance energy transition as well as meeting the energy security needs? So I'd love to think that through the lens of both using the development finance institutions, but also what type of partnerships with Japan and Korea and the more developed countries as well. So Rich first.
Yeah. Well, maybe I'll start with the second half of that, which is, the U.S., Japan, and Korea have, a terrific history of partnership, both on energy development and on energy innovation. If you look at carbon capture, for example, in the U.S., one of our leading demonstrations of that advanced technology is based on Japanese technology with Japanese co-financing of the project. And I think that there are all kinds, if you look at the leading nuclear development in the EMEA region, the Baraka plant in Abu Dhabi, that is effectively a JV of Korean nuclear technology and a lot of U.S. nuclear expertise going into building and making that plant, and financing from the U.S. Export-Import Bank. So I think that there are all kinds of opportunities to commingle expertise, technology, actual EPC and building and finance going into these. And, I think to Ashley's earlier point about, the region being able to work together to sort of push back against some of these Chinese developments, I think there's all kinds of opportunities there with the more developed nations. And obviously with the less developed nations, I think that there are tremendous opportunities either for, group partnerships or bilateral partnerships between the United States and, say, in Indonesia on rapidly demonstrating, a whole wave of these technologies. In the near term, again, that's probably things like gas and then energy storage, which would help them deal with some of the issues of the variability in today's really low cost intermittent renewable technologies. I hope in the future that's more advanced things as well. I mean, I think it's criminal that the world is not doing more with Indonesia to work on capturing its gigantic geothermal reserves. I mean, that's it's literally a series of volcanic islands that got some of the best geothermal reserves in the world, and again, soon will be the third most populous nation. That's a low hanging fruit right there that the whole world should be working with them to develop, and certainly the U.S. and Indonesia should have a bilateral arrangement to capture a near term decarbonizing opportunity like that.
Thanks, Rich. David, you want to jump in?
Sure. Well, it's development finance corporations, so they're going to be focused on low income countries, and they have some flexibility to deal with, kind of lower middle income countries. And I would say probably step one is DFC ought to use that flexibility where it can in order to leverage more capital. I think there's probably a lot of opportunity for independent power production, because you can get a project where you've got a specific off-taker that's going to pay a good rate. I think IPPs are good. I think storage makes a lot of sense because people will pay for storage. I think gas in places like Vietnam, can be really important. ESCOs, energy saving corporations, investments, and people can use efficiency and other means to lower the cost and pay themselves out of those lower fees. I think all of that is a good possibility, and we'll see where we end up on Chapter 6 in the conversations in Glasgow. Because if it turns out we have a global trading system, then I think there might be opportunity for decarbonization of heavy industry, not only in Japan and Korea. It wouldn't be DFC money, but it would be projects, but in other countries where you might be able to use first blue hydrogen and later green hydrogen to decarbonize steel and aluminum and some of those heavy industries. And if you've got outside capital that's able to go in and get credit, they can figure out who gets the credit, then I think that would be a huge area, both for significant carbon reduction, but also for a significant return on investment. And I think you'd have big partners, working with the DFC to do that. I think that's going to be, you've seen from the First Movers Coalition, decarbonization of heavy industry is the next big thing. And so I think that's where they're going to want to move capital. And I think you can get ESG money, you can get DFC money, you can get project development, you can get first mover pay down. You can really have some incentives there, but you're going to need that Chapter 6 framework to get fixed next week.
Mm-hmm. Ashley.
To highlight a few things that David and Rich had commented on. One, I do think hydrogen is one of those areas that is definitely a focus of this administration. The Department of Energy is really going to, I think, spend a lot more time on hydrogen, but this is already something I know Japan has been working on, ASEAN has been working on. I mean, this is certainly something that there might be some really good areas for cooperation. The other, I do want to echo Rich's earlier point on nuclear, particularly with Japan and Korea. This is a hard topic because I know there are a lot of national security concerns, then there's the safety concerns, but some of the opportunities on advanced reactors, SMRs, I think is a really promising area as we do try to find ways that we can maximize the research that we're doing. It is a very expensive area, and I think, again, really some important areas for cooperation. One that I would like to highlight is it's not really technology specific, but is capacity training. I think this is also something that is really important as we do look at cooperation of not just providing either funds or the technologies, but also making sure that people have the tools to use these technologies. And there's really great programs across Southeast Asia, across South Asia that are working on building up capacity training in more rural areas so that they can kind of work on their own grids and transition from different fuels. But I think that's another area that's worth paying attention to is not only the technologies, but how we use them and how we can kind of train the next generation, those who might be more accustomed to different sources or different industries. and to prepare them for some of those processes moving forward, I think is also really important for cooperation.
Randy, if I could just jump back in, one other thing we haven't talked about, I think it is really ripe for DFC and USAID is cross-border interconnection in Asia. Now, the ASEAN Power Grid, this is an idea that's been around for 20 years or so, and it's not going to be one massive interconnected grid, but it has been a series of very helpful cross-border connections, and I think that's where optimizing this cooperation, so we're not just picking one country, that's going to benefit for something. I think it's really, really helpful. It'll be important geopolitically, and it'll also be important for investment. So I'd love to see DFC and USAID and the banks, sort of lean in on that, and for countries, for the region to come up with viable projects for that cross-border interconnection.
Yep. Okay, we have one more question from the audience. So from Hayden Lee. Hayden asks, what has changed since the Biden administration and his Build Back Better initiatives? Do you think the U.S. is actually closer to meeting its climate goals, and I'm going to editorialize a little bit here, or is it more rhetoric and not actually reality? I saw Rich had a smirk on his face, so I'm going to go to Rich first.
Well, things have changed. I'll point to one thing, right, which is, there's been a huge amount of discussion in Congress about a legislative strategy to all this. Where we have actually seen a real development is our Senate in a robustly bipartisan way. So 69 votes, including Republican leader McConnell, supported what in a normal year would look like a vast once in a decade infrastructure package. So $1 trillion bill, which has an enormous investment in clean energy infrastructure, in demonstrating advanced clean energy technologies, again, in a very, very bipartisan way. If we did not have this other discussion along the side about even a larger package, which would be an entirely partisan package, for better or for worse, this alone, I think, would have looked like an enormous political victory, and in a very bipartisan way in the U.S. And so I think we're seeing a really positive development there, since the beginning of the Biden administration, that there is some willingness to work in a bipartisan way on this kind of legislation in the U.S. legislature.
Well, the Democrats have to get that through the House first, and that's its own problem. Yeah, David.
Well, I think they made I think that's a great point. It's a historic investment, and it's got a lot in there for transmission and things like that. I think you're going to see this morning the Democratic Party is going to announce its unity on the reconciliation package, which is going to include over $550 billion compared to the 80 billion or 60 billion that we saw in the Obama 2009 recovery, for energy, everything from clean energy incentives, their tax incentives, resilience, government procurement, and environmental justice that we talked about earlier. So it's going to be a huge historic investment. So I think the money going into that is real. And I think the regulatory aspect of it, which is both going to be on methane emissions for existing and new sources, is real. The incentives on electric vehicles and the incentives for those, for allowing for more companies to have those incentives, that's going to be real. And then the SEC disclosure coming up this fall on climate risk, which is going to drive the way companies operate and the way institutional investors interact with them. I think all that's real. I think it's both real and it's irreversible. So I think that has changed. I mean, the politics have changed, but more than that, the economics of climate have changed. And that's what's really driving all of this. So I think it's real. I think it's not just talk. I think it's not going to change. And I think it's going to be really ugly. But, by the first of the new year, we're going to have both that bipartisan infrastructure package and a reconciliation package. And then it's full steam ahead on regulation for the rest of the Biden term.
And Ashley.
David had made this point earlier as we look at the private sector and markets. And I think that is another thing that we are seeing change, and a lot will comment that it's too little too late in terms of some of what the large energy companies are doing, but we are seeing shifts, and I do think that is important. And really, I think in some of this is social pressure, social movements of what do consumers want. It's important to note that is a factor here. It might change. That is the nature of people. But I do think as we see that trend where it is now and where it's going, with younger generations in particular, that does signify a change. It doesn't solve it necessarily. We still have a lot of roadblocks and challenges ahead, but I do think we are seeing some change here. It might take a while. We have a lot to accomplish in terms of legislation, but again, there is some cooperation here. There is mutual interest, and I think that is important to note.
Wonderful, thank you. We have no more questions for the from the audience. So I thought if since we're out of those questions, maybe we would wrap up early. So I'll let everybody make some closing statements about what they, and the question that I'd like to frame the closing statement as is, what do you hope to see from the COP in the next 2 weeks that would have a positive impact on climate action in the Asia Pacific region? So, really easy question to close it out. And so let's start with Ashley, and then we'll go back, Ashley, Rich, and David.
I think what I would most like to see is we did recently see the commitment of the U.S. or the stated commitment to increase our funding to 11.4 billion for climate financing. It would be excellent if we could finally hit that 100 billion annual target as we do work on some of these cooperative efforts on technology development, tech transfers, climate change adaptation efforts. So that's also something that is often less discussed, but I think also really important. So that for me, I think would be one of the most important things to come out is how do we actually get there and hold countries accountable to those commitments in order to see some of that government level financing being mobilized.
Thank you. Rich.
So COPs are a cacophony, and only a few messages ever come out of them. I think that one that will clearly come out is this global agreement on methane control. I think that's really positive. I hope another message that makes it through the cacophony at this COP is a global recommitment to nuclear. Obviously, this has been, as Ashley mentioned, this is a tough topic. It's been one of much debate. There are major players who are leaders in the climate movement, like Germany, that actively work against one of the major technologies to solve climate. That's problematic. I think given the global energy crisis, you've seen a number of the big European players that still have a commitment to nuclear sort of doubling down, recommitting on that. The UK, the host country, being one of them that said, nuclear is going to be central to their decarbonization efforts. France, obviously coming back into this. There are rumors of a big announcement on some kind of bilateral cooperation between U.S. and another major global player that may be announced at the COP. So I think you could imagine a global recommitment to nuclear as a valid important climate mitigating tool being a good signal to come out.
Thank you, Rich. And David, the final word.
Sure. I think a few things. I'd love to see an agreement on Chapter 6. I think that'll be a big driver of investment in carbon reduction. I'd like to, I hope that we'll see on a country basis, a significant renunciation of coal going forward so that we can move to other technologies. I think I'd like to see, and I think we will see, a huge number of private sector commitments for how they're going to decarbonize their own value chains and industries, and some individual country commitments on nuclear. I think it's going to be hard to get a COP commitment on nuclear. I think it's not on the agenda, but having a number of countries and companies talk about the path forward on nuclear will have a demonstration effect. And I think that will be powerful and important. And and the final one, and Ashley nailed it. It's show me the money. I think we've got to have both the U.S. and the other commitment on climate finance. If we don't have that and it's not credible, then I think this COP will be a failure. If we have it going forward, then the next step is how do we spend it effectively? And how do we move forward to match those NDCs with projects? And that's an agenda I think that we can work with.
David, thank you. And thank you, Ashley and Rich. Really appreciate your comments today. I learned a lot. I always do when I spend time with you. So really, really appreciated that, and appreciate you all waking up a little bit early to do this. I want to thank everybody out in the audience watching through the CU platform for joining us. It's a really great event. And again, as I said at the beginning, looking forward to getting back to Singapore so we can do this in person again. And congratulations to see you folks on another fantastic conference. We'll be working very closely, the Atlantic Council, on the topics that we addressed today, particularly at COP26 and after. So please keep an eye out for the Atlantic Council's work on this. We will be doing a live web show every day from the COP called Live from COP20, Atlantic Council Live from COP26, which will be at 5 p.m. GMT. So please stay tuned. We'll be announcing that shortly. Until next time, which we hope is in person, thank you again for joining us, and have a good afternoon, evening in Singapore.
Thanks, Phil.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.